Yeah, it's really outdated, and that's getting back to where I was saying it's such a beautiful time right now, because not only are we getting all these new systems coming into place and a lot of people realizing that these should be all private sector sort of facilities or duties, so they're building all that, which is amazing. We're seeing all that. Even Bitcoin is a great example of that. They've created a new money outside of the government and central banking system that cannot be shut down. It's beautiful. All this stuff is being built. So at the same time that we're building all this amazing stuff, all the old stuff is just falling apart. We're seeing the police state, and that's also being exposed as well by a lot of anarchists. People like Cop Block with Pete Eyre, who was a past guest on Anarchast. They've got literally millions of people watching them, and they expose the cops every time that they do a brutality or murder or shoot someone's dog, and they've got the video and everything. So they're exposing, and the system is just falling apart. It's just any communist, any centrally planned system, any system without a profit motive or a way to see if they're actually doing anything good will never succeed. That's been proven countless times in history, and it's just all falling apart. So we have the system falling apart and a new system being built right now. It's actually just an incredible time.
Yeah, there's so many interesting new technological advances. I talk about in my book how PayPal had to solve this problem of online fraud. And once they realized you can't deal with it through the courts, you can't deal with it through the law, they implemented a system to predict and prevent fraud before it occurs. So they use a combination of artificial intelligence coupled with human intelligence to say, all right, this transaction is likely legitimate, this transaction is likely fraudulent, requiring additional bits of information. They were one of the first people to have a commercial implementation of CAPTCHA, where you have to type out these odd letters. And then by doing that, they actually shut the hackers down, the fraudulent hackers down. And nowadays, we have a fraud loss ratio of PayPal of 0.5%. So the more effective you can come up with a solution to prevent problems from occurring, the more irrelevant the inefficacy of government courts become. There's even some new technology now which I think has tremendous potential. It's based on what are called smart contracts, which is related to Bitcoin, built off of Bitcoin technology.
Built off the blockchain, yes.
Yeah, the blockchain technology, where you can have these basically automated verification of when a certain event occurs. Then the system is going to basically check off this box and says, yep, this happened, you are owed your money. So for example, in a betting contract, you know who wins the sports event, and then the winner of the betting event automatically gets that money transferred to him or her. So you don't need to go to court. You also don't need to go to the local bookie to threaten private force. It's all going to be done, and as it is done, the great thing about business is figuring out how to do things in a very seamless way without relying on force.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're seeing things like marketplaces pop up. Of course, the first sort of attempt at that did really well was Silk Road by an anarchist, Ross Ulbricht. He has been kidnapped and put into a torture camp for the rest of his life. Well, actually, I don't think it's going to be the rest of his life. I think we're going to get him out. But he's there right now. But the big weakness with that was that it was centralized to some extent. And they've just come out, actually. I just saw just the other day, Open Bazaar, which is a completely uncentralized. It doesn't exist anywhere. It's all basically essentially on the blockchain, or essentially it's not centralized, just went live. So this is going to be a private sort of eBay where you can buy or sell anything you want, and a lot of the things will be similar to those sort of smart contracts. It'll all be automated. There will be no potential for disputes, really. And so more and more these systems are being built up that just make it so anything that anyone thought there was any last vestiges of need for government, which if you're like me, I don't think there ever was any need, but if people think there was still a few needs for it, they're just being outdated right now. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens over the next few years as this continues to go. We're going to see the private systems continue to build and be used, and we're going to see the old system getting worse and worse and more tyrannical. It'd be interesting to see how this all plays out.
Yeah, so the examples you give are kind of at the edge of some illicit products that I would personally never be involved with. But the interesting thing is that this is also widely used for what are now considered completely mainstream products, stock markets, equity transactions. Everybody now would agree stock markets are good for channeling money from investors to companies so they can share in potential equity growth. But when they first were invented, basically 400 years ago, the governments didn't understand them. They viewed them as forms of gambling, in much the way you talked about some of these more illicit markets. And so because of this, people said, all right, we could not do them, or we're going to do it anyway. And luckily, those people back then ignored the law, and they started a secondary market for shares. They traded options, short sales, forward contracts, even though the government thought they were all forms of gambling. So the most mainstream contracts, the things that we now consider, oh, of course we're going to have stock markets, of course we're going to have the ability to buy and sell shares. These are developed privately. So I think that if you look at innovation historically and today, the forefront of this is done through these private marketplaces who are trying to figure out how to prevent problems like predation and fraud, and basically making the modern world possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Another past Anarchast guest and a person who spoke at Anarchapulco just a few weeks ago is Chris Horlacher, who's doing something I believe is called Equibit, essentially trying to put all the stock markets onto the blockchain. All this stuff is happening. It's really incredible. This is really where it's at. If you're not watching this podcast and not getting some money-making ideas, you're falling asleep at the wheel. There's so much potential to change the world right now, and at the same time make money doing it. And it's all happening in this sort of space. It's really interesting because I don't know about you, Edward, but I think you've been an anarchist for like 10 or 20 years, I believe. But it used to be there was not very many anarchists, and the ones there were all broke. And now, thanks to things like Bitcoin and all these new developments, a lot of anarcho-capitalists are out there, and they're all doing very well, creating this private, decentralized world.
Yeah, so Bitcoin, I'm rooting for its success, and I hope it takes off. But even if Bitcoin in its current iteration is not successful, there's so much potential to be built on its underlying technology in much the same way that, we don't have RCA television or Zenith television around, but we have modern computers which have supplanted that. And I think that some of this blockchain technology has so much tremendous potential. You've got mainstream financial institutions looking at this as a way of settling trades rather than having to wait a few days or even a few weeks after the fact. Actually, instantaneously, I know that you have the shares, you know that I have the money. The instant that we make this agreement, there's settlement date. This has been an issue that people have been grappling with for hundreds of years, figuring out, should we have quarterly settlement dates, monthly settlement dates, weekly settlement dates. Now it's done in this new space. They can do it instantly. And mainstream financial institutions, including JP Morgan, are investing billions of dollars looking at these new types of technologies. So it's not like these ideas are that out there that it's for a bunch of hippies hacking in their parents' basement. I think that these ideas have already created so much value for the world, and there's so much more value that can be created in the future as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of funny just using, and you mentioned Bitcoin might not exist a few years from now. It's totally possible. It is sort of the first real attempt at a cryptocurrency. It's doing quite well, though. It's amazingly well, actually, just watching how it gets through every problem it's had. It's currently going through sort of the forking sort of block size issue, which is just another issue of many that it's had along the way, and it always seems to get through it through a complete voluntary merit kleptocracy. There's no one person deciding. It's really the market deciding. It's really beautiful. And you're right. It could fail at some point, but cryptocurrencies are not going away, and this entire concept is not going away at all. It's growing dramatically, and as you mentioned, billions of dollars are being put into this now. So, and some people are going to have nefarious interests in it. People like Morgan Stanley, of course, but you just can't deny this technology. It's just it's unstoppable, and everything's going to be changing over the next few months, weeks, years, and decades for sure. And it's an interesting time to be alive and watch all this and to see how this all works out.
Yeah, and I think that the fact that a Morgan Stanley is interested, or J.P. Morgan rather, they're showing that there's not just a small potential, but a very wide-scale potential for not just having settlement of money transactions, but settlement of stock transactions, settlement of privately held shares in a company can be on a distributed ledger. And so as this technology increases, as people can start basically knowing that they're going to get paid, they're going to get the goods instantly, and you can have third-party verifications added on to that, whether private or, if somebody loves government, they could even say, yeah, I want to have this transaction somehow enforced in government courts. But the more that you have this, the less need, theoretically, there's no need to go to a government court when you have the goods instantly settled, where there's no potential for people from taking their half the bargain and then absconding and then saying, I'm sorry. So these types of solutions, which we've had some great innovations for in the past through things like London Stock Exchange, New York Stock Exchange, have been at the forefront of these things 200 years ago, 100 years ago, figuring out how to make transactions work even when government doesn't enforce them. As this technology improves, it's just going to prove the efficacy of markets and the non-need for relying on this government external party to enforce contracts.
Yeah, absolutely. And just more and more every day, I realize how archaic the old systems are. For example, banking. When I need to send some funds to someone, I send through Bitcoin. It's almost instantaneous, although it's been a little slow lately, a couple minutes or whatever. But it doesn't matter if it's Sunday night at midnight. I press a button and a guy in China's got money. And then when I have to send it, and they don't want Bitcoin or don't know what Bitcoin is or don't accept it, send it through the banking system. It's like, okay, well, I have to wait till tomorrow. It's Sunday. I can't do it on the weekend. Send it on Monday, and then it usually takes a few days and costs a bunch of money, and usually they'll have problems with it and call, and why are you sending this, and who is this person, and we need more information. And I got an email from one bank that I use just the other day, a bank in Canada, and Canada has a form of sort of fascism in the banking industry, as many countries do. So they only allow really 5 major banks in Canada, which has really just made it just a horrible, horrible banking system. And it's really just terrible to use. It's so far behind banking systems I've used in places like Latvia or Singapore or any other place like that. And they sent me an email the other day, and they said, it was just a sort of a spam email sending to all their clients. And they said, just to let you know that as of next week, we will not be accepting wire transfer requests by fax anymore. And I wrote them back and I said, I thought fax died in the 1980s. And but actually, up until a couple of years ago, that was the only way they accepted. Still, to this, up until a couple of years ago, that was the only way they accepted a wire transfer is through fax. So I had this e-fax service. I didn't want a physical fax machine. I just felt like a total idiot if I had one of those sitting in my room, and send them our wire transfer via fax, which is just crazy. But yeah, so all these systems, and you brought up the stock markets as well. All those, even with stocks, if you don't trade stocks, people out there don't trade stocks, you won't know. But if you sell a stock, you don't get the money right away. It's usually about 3 days. And even when you buy stocks, you never really actually own it. They never actually put it in your own name because it would take far too long to transfer the stock certificates all around and everything. They put them in something called street name. So if the brokerage actually goes bankrupt, you don't own that stock, and that stock can go down with the brokerage. Not many people know that, and that will happen in the future, by the way. But all these systems are quite archaic and really falling behind. And that's why you're seeing people, organizations like NASDAQ, investing a lot into blockchain-related companies to figure out how to do these things much better. So all these things are all changing right now. It's just an amazing time.
Yeah, the history of innovation in financial services has been amazing ascent for the past 400 years. And in economics, there's this whole thinking, this set of theories that assume that government is like a chicken that hatches the egg of markets. Well, I think that's completely wrong. I actually would liken government more to salmonella, where it is associated with chickens, it's associated with eggs, but it is not the cause. It did not hatch the eggs of markets. When you look at the innovations that took place in the first stock markets of futures, the equivalent of futures contracts and forward contracts, options contracts, 400 years ago, the idea that you've got these government regulators planning markets 400 years ago, it's just so wrong. And then if you look at what's going on today, there's so much innovation, so much financial deepening that's been taking place over the past couple decades, and there's so much more that needs to be made. And it's done privately. It's not like Barney Frank is like there. He's like, what's the future of technology? It's like these government officials don't really, I'm going to say something controversial. I don't think these government officials really understand economics. They don't understand finance. They're not at the cutting edge of anything.
That is totally not controversial.
So when you see things done, it's done privately. It's done through the marketplace. And the amount of innovation that can take place and continue to take place is just going to be phenomenal if the past is any guide.
Yeah, and we've seen in like the stock markets, I do a lot with the stock markets, especially at the Dollar Vigilante, and I've been around them for 20 years. And so many companies are just not even going public anymore because there's too much hassle, there's too much regulation, and the regulation of the stock markets has so much cost now. There's just so much legalities and lawyers and accountants and all to make sure, that the investor's protected. But, most of the cost of these smaller companies, and that's where a lot of the innovation comes from, is the smaller companies, goes just towards the adhering to the regulations. So it's really stifling it. But now we have things like Bank to the Future and all kinds of crowdfunding ways to raise money, and everything's changing. It's really a phenomenal time.
Yeah, the idea that these regulations are helping the investor. Well, the regulations have tremendous cost for the company, and that actually comes out of the profits of the company. So it's the investor who's paying for the cost of these regulations. And the investor is not the one who's actually demanding the regulation. It's some senator who's come up with some harebrained scheme, Sarbanes-Oxley or Dodd-Frank, who's like, I've got this great idea. If we just enact this regulation, I'm going to prevent the next round of fraud, or I'm going to prevent the next economic downturn. And we can see how ineffective they've been in the past. And I'm quite sure, even after this monstrous Dodd-Frank, which is tremendously burdensome on the economy, on the financial sector, I'm quite sure after the next economic fluctuation, there's going to be a lot of people saying, see, markets did it. There was no regulation. That's why we have this economic downturn, because we didn't have regulation. Whereas they're not realizing that their regulations are backwards looking. They're just simply adding costs to the cost of going public. So the idea that government is there to help people, the idea that government is helping the investor, is something that we just need to completely question, this whole mentality.
Oh, absolutely. It's I've seen it from the inside for decades, how the regulatory agencies just really ruin everything. They don't protect anyone. All the major frauds that have happened, they've never stopped any of them. Talking about things like Bre-X in Canada, the largest mining fraud, they never found that out. It was all found out by private people figuring out what was going on. Things like, who was that recent one in the U.S., the New York... Madoff. Yeah, they didn't just stop that. They actually probably knew about it. A lot of these regulatory agencies, they work with a lot of the other companies. Most of the time what I see is these regulatory agencies just cause problems, and most of the real things that are actual real problems, they just let it slide because they're all sort of working together. It's really ridiculous. I've never seen a regulatory agency help or solve any problem in the market.
Yeah, there was a private analyst named Markopoulos who actually, his fund had an investment strategy similar to what Madoff claimed to have had, and Madoff was claiming that he was earning 1% returns per month with no down months ever. And so this guy was like, oh, that's interesting. I wonder if my firm could replicate this. And he said within 5 minutes, he said, this just can't exist. And he said within 2 hours, he proved mathematically that it is not actual returns. And so he started doing research and put together multiple reports, sent them to the SEC saying, look, this is a huge Ponzi scheme. And the SEC basically didn't really understand what was going on, and they overlooked it. So at the same time we have the SEC, you have private people who actually provided services that could have prevented that, and they actually did prevent it for the vast majority of companies. And it's called third-party custodian accounting services, where hedge funds, even though they're not publicly traded, you can have a third party look at your books every day. You can have a third party be the custodian of the account and actually holding those shares. So the hedge fund manager has no ability to actually take money out of those accounts. Before Madoff, the majority of investors and hedge funds used those services. After Madoff, now it's like 90-something%. All investors say, I demand these services. So there was a private solution in place. Government had their alleged way of weeding these things out. They couldn't do anything about it. And so now the solution is just to continue to add more government regulations, even though they couldn't do anything about it to begin with.
Yeah, it's absolutely ridiculous. And, who has the most reason to be paying attention to whatever they're investing in to make sure it's not fraudulent? It's the people with the money in the company. It's not the regulatory agencies at all. Yeah. And as you pointed out, half the time they're just corrupt. They're on board with the frauds, which has been proven so many times. So many times when they ever look into these frauds, the people involved are at the regulatory agencies. And the other half of the time, these people who are working at these regulatory agencies, the reason they're there is because they're idiots. They can't get a job in the private market. They're not very smart. So they're all a bunch of bureaucrats, and they can't figure anything out. And so people just really have to take control or charge of their own life is really what it's all about. And that's one of the other problems with these regulations and stuff is people have this false sense of security. They figure, well, it's being regulated, so I'm sure I don't have to look into it myself, which just makes everything even worse. I don't have to convince you. You understand what I'm talking about, but a lot of people just don't get it still. But anyway, right. Edward, it's been great talking to you.